Okay, hello everyone. My name is Yuko Ishihara. So I'm an assistant professor, as Hiro said, at Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto. And yeah, first of all, thank you very much, Hiro, for the invitation to give a talk for this series, Consciousness Club series, Consciousness Club Tokyo. I'm really excited to give this talk today. I'll be talking about Heidegger and a bit of Kyoto School tradition towards the end. So the title is Beyond Being in the World, Projective and Open Awareness. Hopefully I can keep it to about 40 minutes. I might go a bit over by 5 minutes or so. But yeah, and I'm not sure about the audience. So mentioned that a lot of people who are participating in these talk series come from various different backgrounds. So I'm not assuming that you have some background on Heidegger or the Kyoto School tradition. I'll try to make it, I have tried to make it as accessible as possible, but I'm sure I haven't, I'm sure it's still quite, difficult to chew on. So I'll be happy to take any kind of questions afterwards. Right, so I want to start by saying something about transitions. So currently, we're living in the middle of a global scale transition, right? So we're making a transition from the pre-COVID-19 era to the post-COVID-19 era. And we're putting a lot of effort to quickly make a transition to this new normal way of being. But I feel that this means that we're not really appreciating the transition as a transition. So we're trying to, quickly get to this, get back to a normal way of living. Okay, maybe we can't call it the same when, it's not going to be the same. So we might call it this new normal, but a transition is a very difficult kind of place to be in because it's a very unsettling place to be. It's a gap in between states. So it's not a good place to be in. And that's why, we want to make a quick move to this new normal way of being. But in doing so, we're not really asking ourselves what this transition really means. So in order to appreciate transitions, so how do we do that? How do we appreciate transitions as transitions? And in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on a specific transition that features in the thought of Martin Heidegger. And this is a transition from what Heidegger calls inauthenticity to anxiety. And what I hope to do is to shed light on the philosophical significance of transitions that take place when one way of being gives way to another. So specifically, in this context, I'm focusing on the transition that we make when the inauthentic way gives way to the anxious way. But before I go any further, I want to mention that the talk is going to be based on this paper that I'm currently working with Eero Chapelius, who just finished his PhD dissertation in Australia at Monash University, and he's a co-author. So, and I believe he's also watching this video right now. Yeah, so I just wanted to note that first. So let's go into the introduction. So I'll give you a bit of a background to Heidegger's thought here. So for Heidegger, the fundamental way that a human being exists is as being in the world. So all particular ways of being, like being an artist or being a scientist, being a philosopher, or even just being a good person, are all founded on the fact that we always already find ourselves in the world. So this, is a very, this is contrasts quite sharply with the Cartesian way of understanding ourselves as this worldless, bodiless subject that exists on its own. So here in Heidegger's starting point of his philosophy is to acknowledge that we human beings are essentially embodied and embedded in a particular place. So finding ourselves in the world for Heidegger involves being open to a particular kind of possibilities, and Heidegger calls these projects. So projects are that for the sake of which we engage in our activities. So for example, Here's a little illustration that I drew up. I might be working in my studio with my canvas, with my brushes and paint in order to complete, let's say, a painting of a sunset. And I'm doing all of this all for the sake of being an artist. So this means that all the possibilities, so the possibilities of picking up the brush and painting the sunset with the various colors are all open in virtue of the project of being an artist. Now, not all of us are artists. I myself am not an artist, but according to Heidegger, all of us exist for the sake of something. So this is to say that for the sake of which is a necessary structure of our being, of being in the world. Now, since this is a consciousness club talk, I want to somehow formulate this in terms of consciousness or awareness. And I'm going to stick to the word awareness. I have a slight preference for this word. So I'm going to stick with awareness. But the kind of awareness that pertains to being in the world, I think, can be described as a kind of projective awareness. So projective awareness is a kind of awareness that projects itself towards the for the sake of which. And I should note that Heidegger and the Heidegger I'm dealing with in this talk is mostly Heidegger of being in time. And we should note that Heidegger doesn't really talk about consciousness or awareness and being in time. He explicitly kind of distances himself from speaking about consciousness in this book. His main idea, the kind of main theme in that book is the meaning of being, understanding what it means to be. So he doesn't himself talk about awareness or consciousness, but nonetheless, I think we can still discern a kind of awareness that's in play and being in the world, and we're going to call this projective awareness. So what Heidegger suggests in being in time seems to imply that our awareness necessarily takes the form of projective awareness. And what we want to do in our paper and in this, what I want to do in this talk is to question this assumption. So is it really the case that our awareness necessarily takes the form of projective awareness? So if this is the case, if it's the case that our awareness necessarily takes the form of projective awareness, then the only kind of possibilities that are available to us are our possibilities in the sense of projects. But we can ask the question, well, what happens in the event where being in the world breaks down? So this is going to be the transition that we're going to be interested in, that we're going to be looking at in more detail in a bit. But we're going to see that when being in the world breaks down, that is, when anxiety takes over, all our projects become closed. So when that happens, what happens when such a transition occurs? Is the possibility of our breakdown, which is a transition of our way of being, also a project? Or is there a different kind of possibility that's involved here? And in our paper, we explore how this breakdown reveals a deeper ontological dimension than being in the world. And we call this, following a Kyoto School philosopher with a SHIZEN, we call this nature-naturing. And in today's talk, I'm going to be focusing on the structure of our awareness when we assume the mode of nature-naturing. And following Arrow's formulation of this in his previous work, in his dissertation, I'm going to call this awareness, I'll call this kind of awareness open awareness. So to be aware in this sense is to be open to what we call the unfolding toward structure and thingly possibilities of phenomena. And I'll describe what this exactly means later on in this talk. But this is going to be a different kind of possibility structure to the for the sake of which and to the projects. So by contrasting these with the for the sake of which structure and projects, I'm going to try to show how this possibility structure is intrinsic to the phenomena themselves. And that open awareness is therefore a more fundamental form of awareness than projective awareness. So the talk is divided into 4 sections. what I'm first going to do is focus on what it means for us to break down. So here we're going to be looking at the transition from the inauthentic state, what Heidegger calls inauthenticity, to anxiety. And then in the second part, we're going to look at the event where a tool breaks down. So Heidegger doesn't really give us, he doesn't really focus on the transition from inauthenticity to anxiety. So he doesn't really give us much tools to understand that specific transition. But he does focus on another transition, which is this transition where a tool breaks down. So we're going to look at that analysis to see if we can find some hints to understand the other transition that we're interested in. And then in the third part, we're going to try to make sense of our breaking down as a natural transition. And we'll try to uncover what this word natural could mean. And then the last part, and the fourth part, I'll try to provide a phenomenological analysis of this natural transition. Right, but before we go into that first part, we should make some distinctions. So for Heidegger, as we said before, for the sake of which is a necessary and invariant structure of our being. But we can contrast this to the contingent structures that fill in the for the sake of which. So these are possibilities. So one type of possibilities are projects. So for example, the project of being an artist, building a house, and so on. But we can also discern a different kind of possibilities that also fill in the for the sake of which we can call ways of being in the world or modes of being in the world. An example of this might be what Heidegger would call the authentic way of being or the inauthentic way of being. We could also talk about the anxious way of being. Now, one thing to note is that projects and ways, these possibilities go hand in hand. So you could take up the project of being an artist in an authentic way, or you could also pick that project up in an inauthentic way. So these always go hand in hand. So these distinctions are going to be important for the rest of the talk. So it's good to keep these in mind. Right. So let's go into the first part. What does it mean for us to break down? So Heidegger characterizes our everyday average mode of being in the world as inauthenticity. And he calls this the falling state. So he tells us that here in this inauthentic mode of being that we normally find ourselves in, it's like our default mode of being. We're falling, not from external objects like cliffs, but we're actually falling from ourselves and towards and into things outside of us. So to be falling in this way is for us to be familiar with the things around us. And these things, they get their meaning from the projects that we engage in. So for example, the project of storing information belongs to what a computer is. The project of getting somewhere belongs to what a train is, and so on. Right? So the computer just is something to store information. Train just is something for us to get somewhere. Right? So the meaning of these objects really depend on the project that we're actually engaging in. Now, we don't actually explicitly and consciously take up these projects in this inauthentic mode, but we're actually integrated into them by virtue of being brought up in a certain society. So the society, we can say in a sense, fills in the for the sake of which with its own concrete projects. It's not like we take them up consciously and deliberately. It's just that we kind of fall into them. We find ourselves already engaged in them, and these projects have been handed down to us by the society. So when we're engaged in these projects in this way, our being gets dissolved and we lose our individuality. So Heidegger calls this state the anonymous day, or this term is das Man. So in English, we use the word you to denote this kind of anonymous way of being, this kind of average, everyday average mode of being. So you might say, you know, you go to university, you get a job, you get married, and you have kids, and so on. You know, to denote this kind of average, everyday way of being in the world. And he calls this way of being the anonymous day. We're not really individualized in this, when we are living in this inauthentic mode. But this can all change when the inauthentic state is disrupted by anxiety, and then we experience a breakdown. So anxiety for Heidegger is not just another kind of emotion. He calls it the fundamental mood. It's very important for him because it has this this role of making us aware of who we are and take kind of control of our own existence. So anxiety here is the realization that our for the sake of which has been stolen from us. So the habitual immersion in projects gives way to the awareness of the possibility of having projects. So for the first time, when anxiety strikes us, for the first time, we become aware that we have the possibility to take up projects. So for the first time, we can say that projective awareness becomes aware of itself as projective. Projective awareness, so to say, gains self-awareness. And at the same time, the concrete projects that the day has filled in becomes empty in the sense that we can no longer engage in them. So the things lose their practical significance, and familiarity gives way to uncanniness and the feeling of not being at home. So it's a very unsettling state. It's not a good place to be in. And there's a general sense of meaninglessness that pervades. And whereas in inauthenticity, one was fleeing from oneself, in anxiety, I stand face to face with myself. So here, for the first time, we face our individual existence. Now, for Heidegger, anxiety is an important step towards a state of authenticity, where we take control of and responsibility for being in the world. But what we're interested in is not so much the role anxiety plays in making a step towards a different state, namely the authentic state. But what we're really interested in here is the transition from inauthenticity to anxiety as such. So some of the questions we can ask here are, what kind of possibilities are involved in the breaking down of our being in the world? Is it our projects, or is there a different kind of possibility that is involved in this transition? Now, unfortunately, Heidegger doesn't really focus on this transition itself as a transition. So he doesn't focus on the transition as a phenomenon. But he does, as I said earlier, focus on a transition that plays a pretty important role in being in time. And this is a transition of tools. So here, we're now getting to the second part. We're going to look at what it means for tools to break down. Okay, and we're going to try to seek some hints for us to understand how we can make sense of this transition from inauthenticity to anxiety. So in a bit, we're going to see that Heidegger's analysis of the breaking down of tools discloses a more fundamental kind of possibility structure than that which belongs to the being of tools. So here, drawing a parallel, we can ask, does the breaking down of being in the world disclose a more fundamental kind of possibility structure than the for the sake of which? Does the transition reveal a different kind of awareness than projective awareness? So let's now take a look at this transition of the tools. So let's say that a pen breaks in the middle of your writing. What kind of possibilities are involved in the transition from the pen's being usable to being unusable? And Heidegger has technical terms for this to to denote the state, the way in which the pen is usable, he uses the word ready to hand. So pens are ready to hand when they are in the state of being usable. And when they break down, or when something happens to it, then it becomes unusable. Then it transitions to this unready to hand state. So first thing to know is that the pen cannot exist on its own, but necessarily refers to other tools. So in Being and Time, Heidegger tells us that, taken strictly, there is no such thing as an equipment, like a single equipment. So for a pen to exist is for it to be involved with other tools, like the paper or the table or the light, etc. And Heidegger calls this this context and the interconnections between the tools a referential whole, or referential totality. And he tells us that this referential whole is prior, both logically and experientially, to its parts. So to say that it's prior logically to its part is to say that it's ontologically prior. So the existence of the referential whole precedes the existence of the parts. And to say that it's experientially prior to its parts is to say that before we encounter the pen as an individual tool, we encounter the whole context. So whenever we are using like a hammer, we're actually first not encountering the hammer as a hammer, like an independent thing, but we're actually encountering the whole context, which is not to say that we're explicitly aware of it, but we're somehow engaged in this whole context prior to us engaging with the parts. So there's a kind of holism going on here. But put differently, for a pen to be usable is for certain possibilities to be open. So the pen appears as able to make marks on paper. The paper appears as able to be marked on, etc. Now, when the pen breaks down, the previously open possibilities now appear as closed, in the sense of not being able to be actualized. It's not like these possibilities disappear, but they now appear as closed, in the sense that you cannot engage with them anymore. They're closed off. So here, at the same time, the pen's possibility of making marks on paper shows itself as a possibility. So when the pen breaks down, that's the first time that we become aware of the fact that this pen has a possibility to make marks on paper. Now, the pen could not exist as a pen if it were not for the possibility of writing our thoughts on paper, for example. And this possibility of writing is not a possibility of the pen that's ready to hand, but it's our possibility, in the sense that it's a project that fills in for the sake of which. So writing is our project. So when the pen breaks down and its possibility of making marks shows itself, well, at the same time, the possibility of writing also becomes conspicuous for the first time. And therefore, the breaking down of the pen discloses a deeper possibility structure than that of ready to hand, namely, for the sake of which. So I've drawn up a little illustration here to illustrate what's going on. So the ready to hand, the tool, when it's ready to hand, it's involved with other tools, and there's a referential whole that's there without it being disclosed as such. It's just there for you at your disposal. But when the tool breaks down and makes a transition to being unready to hand, then that's the first time you become aware that the pen has a possibility of making marks on paper. But at the same time, this breaking down discloses a deeper dimension, which is that you have the possibility of writing. That now you cannot write. When the pen breaks down, realize that you can't write anymore. The project is not is not something that you can engage in anymore. And so you become aware of your project, which is the base of the tools in the first place. So let's now go back to the case that we're interested in, the breaking down of us, the transition from inauthenticity to anxiety. So when this transition takes place, as we said before, all of our projects become closed, right? So when we make a transition, so when anxiety strikes us, we realize that the things around us lose their practical significance. They don't have that pull that it used to have before when you were, engaged in your project before. So things lose practical significance and the projects become closed to you. Now, we want to ask, well, does this transition also disclose the for the sake of which as the underlying possibility? To rephrase it, does the transition to a state where all the projects are closed itself presuppose an open project of some kind? And as contradictory as this may sound, we can actually imagine a case where this is, the answer is affirmative, where this is the case. So Heidegger believed that anxiety actually opens up the possibility of doing philosophy, and specifically the kind of philosophy that he was doing in Being and Time, the existential analysis of Dasein, of human beings. So following this kind of idea, we can think of a scenario where a philosopher maintains an effort to sustain or deliberately bring about the state of anxiety for the sake of doing philosophy. So here, and this might sound like an odd kind of case, but you can imagine a philosopher doing this, in fact. So here we seem to have the same ontological structure as before. The transition from inauthenticity to anxiety is grounded in a project, in our possibility. So, we first looked at the case where the transition from inauthenticity to anxiety, from the ready to hand to unready to hand is based on our project of writing. But on the right-hand side, we see a parallel here. So the transition from inauthenticity to anxiety is also based on a project of the philosopher. Now, we want to say that not only is this not necessary, but it's actually a modification of a more basic situation. So when you understand that the transition in this way, that it's based on a project, you're actually overlooking a more basic situation that's actually occurring here. So the transition from inauthenticity to anxiety is not something that the philosopher primarily brings about, but it's something that happens on its own out of itself. So the project of maintaining anxiety as one's way of being in the world presupposes the occurrence of a spontaneous transition from inauthenticity to anxiety. So before, we thought that this transition from inauthenticity to anxiety is based on a project, but we now see that it's actually the other way around. What makes the project possible in the first place is the spontaneous transition from inauthenticity to anxiety. So the transition that's occurring on its own spontaneously. So now we're going to try to make sense of this breaking down as a natural transition. So what we call the spontaneous transition can also be called a natural one. It's natural at times for being in the world to transition in this way. These transitions happen in and to us, but not from us. So we're not the ones who are bringing them about. But we have to question, well, what does this word natural really mean here? And this is where I want to turn to the thought of the Kyoto School philosopher. So he's the third generation Kyoto School philosopher Ueda Shizuteru, who just passed away last year. So Ueda provides his analysis of this, this word nature, or the natural, in the context of discussing the 10 ox-starting pictures. So just to give you a bit of background about this, the 10 ox-starting pictures is a series of pictures that's used in the Zen Buddhist tradition. And it represents the process of, or the stages towards enlightenment. So what you see in the top left there, that's the first picture. And you see this boy being a bit lost. That's the very beginning of the inquiry into the true self. And then gradually, you know, the second one, you see that he's seen some kind of footsteps, not footsteps, it's actually the steps, not, what do you call that? The marks of the ox. So the ox here represents the true self. And you see that throughout this process, as it progresses, the boy starts to see the true self and tries to grasp it and so on. But what we're interested in here, and what Ueda focuses on in this context, is the 9th picture. So the one that's read Henpon Gengen, that means return to the source, returning to the origin. So Ueda discusses the idea of nature, or natural, as it features in this 9th picture. And he specifically focuses on the original caption that's attached to this 9th picture, which reads as follows: "The flowers blossom just as they blossom. Water flows just as it flows. Hana wa onozu kara kurenai, mizu wa onozu kara bobo." So the key here is going to be the word "just as," which is a translation of onozu kara. So what does this onozu kara really mean? And Ueda analyzes the Japanese word for nature, shizen, as it's used colloquially when we say shizen ni, naturally, or shizen sa, naturalness. So shizen is comprised of 2 Chinese characters. The first character, ji, which means self in general. So this one is read as onozu kara. And this means, or this designates that something is occurring of itself, on its own, naturally, spontaneously. And this is often contrasted with the word mizukara, which actually uses the same Chinese character. And it's all actually sometimes even written in the same way. So the ji and the hiragana ra, but it's read differently. So mizukara designates that something is done by oneself. So if you say mizukara kangaeru, that means think by yourself. Whereas if you say onozu kara akiraka ni naru, that means something becomes clear on its own, out of itself. So that's the first character. The second character, shikari, the character for the zen of shizen, means to be so. It's an affirmation. So taken together, shizen originally means to be so of itself. It's an affirmation of what it is of its own accord. So taking this kind of interpretation of what the word means in the original Japanese, Ueda tells us that shizen does not originally designate natural entities like trees or the river. It also doesn't designate a specific region of beings called nature. So when we hear the word nature, we often think of some place outside of the city, like the mountains or the woods. But he tells us that that's not the original meaning of the word. Rather, nature, shizen, originally designates a way of being that is so of itself. So just as onozu kara designates the natural way of being. And to denote it's a dynamic character, we're going to call this, following with a nature naturing. So nature naturing is a translation of the medieval term natura naturans. Literally, it means nature naturing, which is contrasted to natura naturata, which means nature natured. And so what they're getting, what this difference gets at is, so nature naturing is nature understood as an active principle, that it's producing, it's productive and creative, whereas nature natured denotes more of the nature as a passive principle, nature as it has been created and produced. But Ueda focuses on nature as this dynamic principle and calls it nature naturing. And we want to capture this kind of dynamic character of nature. So we're going to call this nature naturing. And Ueda suggests that this natural way of being is not unique to flowers and water, but it's something that we humans too, can become. So in what sense is the transition from inauthenticity to anxiety a natural transition? Well, in the sense that this movement is not purely a movement of and within being in the world, but it's a movement of and within nature naturing. But to tune into this movement requires that our awareness changes from one that projects towards the for the sake of which to one that is open to the way things unfold according to their own ways of being. So whereas projective awareness is constitutive of being in the world, we want to say that open awareness is constitutive of nature naturing. Right, so we get like a picture like this. So this spontaneous transition is understood as a natural transition, a movement that occurs in nature naturing. And this is accompanied by, or in order to tune into this awareness, awareness has to take the form of open awareness. And this contrasts with the kind of projective awareness that projects itself towards the for the sake of which that it's trying to achieve. Right, so Ueda provides us some important insights into how to understand this natural transition. But unfortunately, he doesn't give us much to chew on. So what we need is a phenomenological analysis of this natural transition. And we want to, and we think that by doing this, we can make this idea of the natural transition a bit more concrete. So what we want to do is to contrast the structures that pertain to being in the world with the structures that also pertain to nature naturing. So, one implication here is that we don't think nature naturing is without structure. It might be something, it might sound very simple for something to simply spontaneously move from one way of being to another, but it actually has its own structure. And what we want to do is really to uncover this structure. So we introduce the word unfolding towards structure to contrast that with the for the sake of which structure of being in the world. So remember that the for the sake of which structure is the necessary and invariant structure of being in the world. Well, we want to say that unfolding towards structure is the necessary and invariant structure of nature naturing. And whereas projects fill in the for the sake of which, well, thingly possibilities fill in the unfolding towards structure. So let's take an example of a flowing stream. And this is a picture of Takasegawa, which is this small canal running parallel to Kamogawa in Kyoto. It's just a few streets off of where I live. So when we take a flowing stream, when we think of a flowing stream is necessarily open to the future. So without a futorial dimension, a flowing stream would not be a flowing stream. But such openness towards the future can have two distinct meanings. So the first sense in which the flowing stream is open to the future is based on the for the sake of which. So say you come to Kyoto, you visit Tokyo, and you come across this stream, and it's so photogenic that you decide you need to take a photo of it. And indeed, during the cherry blossom season, you know, the cherry blossoms are in full bloom right beside the canal. So it's full of tourists taking out their smartphones. So here, the project of having the photo plays an important role in determining how the stream itself appears and what the stream is for that person. So the stream appears as having the possibility of being captured on camera, and the stream itself also forms a kind of referential whole with the other things around. So the sun also appears as having the possibility of providing enough light. The camera appears as having the possibility of taking photos, and so on. So by sketching out a certain future of actually having this photo, and perhaps you know, sharing it on Instagram, by sketching out a certain future, for the sake of which shapes the stream as something that is ready to hand. So it's merely a tool for us to, for the person to obtain this photo and perhaps even recognition from others. But there's another sense in which the stream is open towards the future. When this is already implicit when we speak about the stream as flowing. So the stream itself is ever changing in time. It's in a state of constant renewal. So just as the possibility of having the photo is now present as a possibility, well, the future state of the stream itself is now present as a possibility of the stream itself. And this kind of possibility that pertains to the stream itself is not our possibility in the sense of projects, but it is intrinsic to the phenomena itself. And we call this kind of possibility the thingly possibility of the stream. But whereas thingly possibilities are contingent on the phenomena in question, here the stream, the general sense that things are unfolding towards some future state, that's common to all phenomena. And we call this the unfolding towards structure, and this is the invariant and necessary structure of naturing. So going back to the case of the transition from inauthenticity to anxiety, when the philosopher maintains an effort to sustain the state of anxiety for the sake of doing philosophy, there's a kind of grasping at a particular way of being in the world. But let's say that this philosopher lets go of this project. When he does this, it's not that he loses the possibility of becoming anxious. Rather, it's just that he is now no longer trying to control when this possibility will become an actuality. So the when is actually decided upon by the phenomenon itself. The phenomenon has its own future towards which it is unfolding, and when the time comes, the transition will be made to anxiety. So here, anxiety is an intrinsic thingly possibility of being in the world, and the transition from inauthenticity to anxiety is an instance of something unfolding from one state to another. So again, whereas grasping was a kind of state that's characteristic of the projective awareness, here the key is to tune in to the way in which nature natures. So we finally come to the conclusion. We looked at the transition from inauthenticity to anxiety in an attempt to disclose the underlying possibility structure of the transition. And we discovered that our inauthentic state unfolds towards anxiety, which is a thingly possibility of our being, and that this kind of possibility is intrinsic to the phenomenon. This means that thingly possibilities, which pertain to the things themselves, are hidden underneath the possibilities that we carve out based on our project. The thingly possibilities are always there, but most of the time we're oblivious to them. because we're so, concerned to accomplish our projects. But in order to tune into these thinly possibilities, projective awareness must give way to open awareness. So not only is it not necessary that our awareness takes the form of projective awareness, but projective awareness is also not the most fundamental kind of awareness. And even though our access to it is usually covered up, we're fundamentally part of nature, and as such, our awareness is fundamentally open rather than projective. All right, so that would be the end of my talk. Thank you for tuning in, and that's the selected bibliography.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for the talk. So we want to look we have like Q&A session, so we can, if you have any questions, you can actually ask, because I already checked the Slido, but nobody already put the question here. So yeah, anyone from like Zoom, people can talk. If not, actually, I have one question. It's sorry, it's kind of difficult. It's kind of fast for me to really talk about, listen to the like philosophy stuff in English. But I was wondering, you mentioned like in authenticity to anxiety transition, but I also wondered, there is a like kind of anxiety to in authenticity transitions, because as I think in the talk you mentioned that doing some kind of philosophy is kind of tuning in that kind of transition, but usually most of people not aware of doing philosophy, because maybe that transition immediately in authenticity, anxiety to inauthenticity. What do you think about? Is that like, does it make sense? That question?
Yeah. Sure, yeah. So yeah, thanks for the question. So first of all, one thing to clarify is that what a philosopher does is you said he tunes into this transition, but that's not really what he's doing. Even though so what we said, well, what we want to say is that before he makes this into a project, so what a philosopher does is to make it into a project. So he wants to kind of somehow deliberately bring about this anxious way of being, or he tries to sustain this anxious way of being. But either way, he's putting a lot of effort to do this, to bring this state about. But this is quite in contrast to a person who just tunes into the transition. There's no grasping, there's no trying to control it. When you tune in, you're just trying to stay with the transition and see where it goes. So what a philosopher is doing is quite counter to what you would do if you were to tune in. But I think you mentioned an interesting point. This going back from so we often tune in and just trying to stay with the transition.
Sorry. Oh wait, sorry. Who's okay? Yeah, you can talk.
Sorry. Yeah. So we oftentimes we fall into this anxious state where everything becomes meaningless. And it's not like we bring it about. So that was one of the upshot of this talk, is that even if sometimes an odd philosopher might come around who makes this into a project and tries to maintain this anxious way of being, oftentimes, when we fall into this anxious way of being, what we want to do is get out of it, right? And Heidegger says that, well, we should take this as an occasion to move forward and to actually become responsible for our way of being. But that, there's a good possibility that you just simply revert back to taking this inauthentic way of being, which is, just following the projects that are handed down to you by society and so on. And that's, I would say that that's, it's also in our nature to do that. It's not easy to become responsible, to kind of, really take this as a wake-up call and try to take a project that you feel that you are responsible for. But oftentimes, I think what happened is that we just go back to this, normal way of being, and we even forget that this kind of breakdown really happened to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right, right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, okay. So we have actually I got the questions from Slido, so maybe I'm gonna share a little bit. Okay, where is it? Okay. So sorry, like I'm gonna share the, okay. Okay, so I got the question from Ono. He or she has 3 questions. Like, can you see the Slido? The screen? Yeah, okay. Yeah. On the going beyond being in the world, isn't this something that Heidegger himself accomplished in his later thought with forward? Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Honor. Yeah, he's a good friend of mine.
Okay.
Yeah, so he knows his Heidegger well, and yeah, it's true. I think it's so. In our paper, we actually don't discuss later Heidegger, but Brett Davis, for example, in one of his papers from 2014, I think he discusses how Heidegger later Heidegger talks about a different kind of idea of nature than what he talked about in Being in Time. And this idea of nature comes very close to what we're talking about with nature naturing. And we are really interested to pursue that line of thought and to see how much later Heidegger's notion of nature comes close to this this idea of nature that is very much rooted in the Japanese tradition, but which the Kyoto School tradition kind of took up. But yeah, that's something that we'll be interested to look into. But yeah, I do think that in terms of going beyond being in the world, yes, it's true that Heidegger did probably accomplish it in his later thought. I'm not exactly sure whether the way we go beyond being in the world is exactly the same as the way Heidegger did, though.
Yeah, okay. So the second question, okay, isn't the human being structured as being in the world, has a notion of this flowing as flowing? Do rivers flow for butterflies?
Isn't the human being structured as being in the world, has a notion of this flowing as flowing? Do rivers flow for butterflies? I see. I think I understand what you mean, Nunur. So the way I'm understanding this question is, do human beings also have its own way of flowing? Maybe that's one way of understanding it. Well, certainly human beings has its own way of unfolding, we would say. The way that the unfolding torus structure of human beings is quite different from, or so it's better to say the thingly possibilities of human beings is quite different from the thingly possibilities of, the river, of animals, of things around us. We, as a species, have our own way of unfolding towards the future. And tuning into that would be to take up this kind of open awareness. I'm not sure if I really answered the question, but yeah.
Right. And the third question, maybe he's okay. Third question. So, doesn't the open awareness necessitate a knowledge of the world and earth, which is the main idea of the later fourth form in the Heidegger's thought?
So I have to admit, I don't know much of Heidegger's later thought, but I do think that, I'm thinking about that origin of the work of art and how he talks about earth. And that way of talking about the earth sounds very much like what we're talking about in terms of nature. And I would just note that Ueda Shizuteru, so the Kyoto School philosopher I talked about, he talks about the twofold being in the world. In Japanese, it's niju sekai nai sonzai. So here he's, explicitly drawing on Heidegger's notion of being in the world, but he wants to say that our being is actually twofold. And according to Ueda, as you would know, according to Ueda, the being in the world is, one way in which we exist, but that's not it. So this idea of twofold being in the world actually goes, it actually resonates a lot with what we're saying in this paper. And we actually, in the paper itself, we actually draw on this idea of twofold being in the world. But the idea is that being in the world is actually founded on naturing, or he calls it koku, the hollow expanse. There is this sense of the twofoldness that's at work in Ueda's thought that I also think might be kind of, we probably would be able to find something similar in later Heidegger's thought as well.
Then he got one more question, maybe. No, maybe two more. Okay. Nature, unnaturing, and unnature and naturing as a transition.
So nature, unnaturing, and that's interesting. Yeah, so nature is always naturing. It's just that whether we notice it or not. So although nature is always naturing, when it's kind of hidden, hidden underneath our projective, for the sake of which, and the projective awareness, it's kind of there, but it's there as a hidden ground. But you could say that when we're engaged in our projects and we're kind of doing a lot of things that nature herself wouldn't really maybe do, then we're kind of hindering naturing. So when that's happening, maybe we could say that we could say that it's a state of naturing. Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, so maybe last question from Slido. Ritsu's break, decay is acknowledged in temporal aspect of them, such as mono no aware. Any comment on these aesthetics in the context of Heidegger's transition?
Paul. I believe this is the Paul that I know. So regarding tools breaking, yeah, sure. The decaying of a tool is a way in which, so the decaying of a tool, what's happening is that the decay is the materiality of the tool decomposing, right? So it's actually, this kind of decaying pertains to the unfolding toward structure, or the thingy possibility of the tool itself. So if it's the hammer, it has a possibility to decay, and that pertains to the thingy possibility of that tool. And to look at that, so you can look at that from two different perspectives at least, right? One is to look at that from the perspective of, looking at this as a piece of tool. When you do that, decaying is a kind of, it's a kind of breaking down of the tool. So we get into a similar kind of situation as before. But you can look at decaying from a different perspective. And here you have to look at it from a kind of aesthetic perspective. And I think that's where the kind of idea of the mono no aware is coming from. You're not looking at this tool as a tool. You're looking at this object as something that has the possibility to decay, and therefore it's beautiful to acknowledge that it can have this kind of it has this kind of possibility in itself. So I would say that mononawari is actually an acknowledgement of this kind of unfolding towards structure. Yeah, I hope that answers it. That's an interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll stop the share. Though, yeah, someone can ask questions. Yeah, sure.
May I?
Yeah, sure.
A little bit difficult in English, but I'll try. You mentioned that unfolding towards structure. What do you mean by structure? I'm a scientist, and I always see the world through some models.
Yeah.
Mathematical model or linguistic model. And when you talk about structure, what is it? What is it?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. What do I mean by structure? So we can think about what Heidegger is trying to do when he gives these like technical words to tools. Like we just talk about tools as tools, but he talks about tools as being ready to hand, and how it can transition to the unready to hand. Or he talks about our way of being as being in the world and how it has the structure of, the for the sake of which, right? Now, when he gives these different terms to these different components of our being, what he's trying to do is to articulate what seems so simple, right? And this is what Heidegger is doing in his existential analysis of human beings, of what he calls Dasein, and being in the world, and being in time, in that book. So what he's doing is like he's looking at the way in which we exist in the world, which seems like a very simple thing. We engage with tools all the time, right? We're engaged in projects all the time, but we don't reflect on this so much and what that actually means. So what he's doing is trying to articulate the complexity that is inherent in what at first sight looks very simple. And that's part of what phenomenology does in general. It tries to articulate the complexity. So perhaps another word for structure is complexity. And I'm sure that you have different ideas that's attached to this word complexity, but there's a kind of there's much more complexity in this what seems so simple at the outset, and that's what we're trying to do. And what we try to do in the paper is the same thing as Heidegger. We're just focusing on the way in which things unfold towards its own future state, and we're trying to articulate the structure that's inherent in this way of being. That is different from the kind of way in which our projects work. Does that answer your question somehow?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Do you have any further question or someone else?
Actually, I'm in the field of artificial intelligence these days, and I doubt all the pre-articulation of the world. I mean, names and some a priori definition of things. So I'm very much interested in your talk.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank
yeah.
you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So yeah, does anyone have a question? Yeah. Anything is. I mean, we have some time like for the Q&A session. So.
I'll be interested to hear what kind of implications this could have for AI. I actually have no idea, but I thought that engaging with Heidegger might be interesting because a lot of people who work on AI do have some kind of acquaintance with Heidegger through Dreyfus, I think. And so I felt like that might be a kind of way to engage, although I don't think I did a really good job doing that.
Yeah, I think in general, like this philosophy, phenomenology, and also related to some work like Nishida and Heidegger's. Like I think the interesting to AI researchers, because I think lots of people already try like some, or realize somehow the functions of things. I mean, we can manipulate some robot toward like grasping things, but we somehow don't understand yet like what like how we formalize what we perceive, or how we sense the world. I think that how we can put that kind of things as a mathematical form, or like we put that things in a different existence like robotics, and how we can understand in the animal. I think that point, like people, that's why I think people start interested in like philosophy and like phenomenology. I think that's like how I see the people interested in like phenomenology, like from the AI researchers, I think. But maybe the author has a different opinion, but
yeah, can I ask? Yeah, actually, I also wanted to ask so implications for AI, and but in my case, I couldn't really follow this kind of second part, or I could understand this breaking down of a pen, that kind of thing. So I think that's relatively straightforward to interpret in terms of AI, because no, it's kind of I think it's kind of a like sort of metacognition. So you may have some like a primary sort of perception of affordances, but then when you're using a tool like a pen, you don't realize you have this kind of capability or possibility of using a pen for a particular purpose, because you're already using it. But then you gain some metacognition about this possibility when it fails. So that's kind of understandable. So I think I can sort of formulate this in terms of metacognition in AI. But I couldn't completely understand when you shifted to the transition from inauthenticity to anxieties, because the meaning of it wasn't very clear, and also they seem to be more difficult to translate into AI. So can you sort of elaborate on these concepts so that maybe we can find a way to apply to AI?
Yeah, thank you. So, okay, right. So the transition from inauthenticity to anxiety, well, we don't really have to use the word inauthenticity. That might be a bit, it's kind of misleading, because when we call it inauthenticity, that's already assuming, that is an inauthentic world. It's kind of talking about, you're looking at this state that we're normally in, and you're making kind of judgment about it, right? But what he means by this state, where he calls it inauthentic, is a state where we're just involved in various projects. We're doing things, for the sake of something, but we're not really taking up this project in a way that would make us responsible to what we're doing. So we're kind of like, just following what society tells us to do, basically. And he tells us, he says that this is the kind of average everyday way of being that we human beings are. So most of us are in this way, and are taking up this way of being, where we're just kind of doing things just because, that's because that's the way society goes. Like that's, we don't know why we went to university. Well, we do, but it's, we can't really give a good answer. We say, well, that's just the way people, that's just what people do. So this is a kind of default way.
But then is it also related to intention or free will? So maybe like if you just flow with a kind of dynamical system, without trying to make any change to the course of your future action, then maybe you're not making a conscious choice. But then is that mode of being this inauthenticity?
Yeah, in terms of free will, I'm not sure how to formulate it. It's a bit tricky, I think. So it's not like we're determined by some force to do that. We actually, we are consciously doing it, but the projects that we're engaged in are just handed down to us by society, right? So that's the kind of default way that we human beings are in the world. But what happens in anxiety is that everything loses its meaning. And I think all of us must have had at least some glimpse of this, right? Where, we've been kind of like, pursuing various projects, or like all your life, maybe you've been, working so hard to get into that top university, working really hard afterwards to get into that good, get into that good company or whatever. We're doing all these things and working really hard, but then there comes a time when, suddenly strikes you that, why are you doing this, right? And then you can no longer engage in the project like you used to before. Like it all kind of loses meaning. And
is that lack of goals, or so does that mean the person lost sort of like clarity in their goals? So no.
Yeah, you could.
So is this uncertainty? Is this anxiety about uncertainty about future goals, or is it uncertainty about the world itself? So
right, yeah. So yeah, Heidegger says the anxiety doesn't have an object, right? So we can't really say what we're anxious about. It's just general sense, right? We're just anxious. We can't. The thing about anxiety that's so striking is that it kind of like you can't really make sense of that. So Heidegger also says, like, when you go back, when you're in this anxious state, and oftentimes it doesn't last for that long. So you go back to your normal way of living, and you go back doing all these things that you used to. And someone asks you, well, what happened that something happened to you? And you say, no, it was nothing. Right? You can't really articulate it. You can't really make sense of what happened, really. So, but what we wanted to say using this transition is that this kind of transition, well, what we wanted to focus on was this kind of the possibility structure of this transition. So what we mean by that is that, well, what's the kind of, what makes this transition possible? And Heidegger doesn't really have an answer to that. He would want to say that, okay, well, the kind of analysis I gave was that following this, tool analogy, when we break down, well, that's kind of, we bring that about. So that's the case of that odd philosopher who makes anxiety into a project. But what we want to say is that this transition is something that naturally happens. So it's in the nature, in other words, it's in the nature of our being to make this kind of transition. And it's very important. And it doesn't have to be just this transition, but any kind of transition happens on its own before we bring it about. Like we deliberately bring it about.
One clarification question. So in this case, breaking down means that we become uncertain about what kind of goals we have. Is that the right interpretation? Or
breaking down here means that, yeah, you could say that. You can also say that the possibilities, right? Or if you want to talk in terms of affordances, the affordances that was there before you, that were open to you before, are now closed. You can't engage with them. They don't have that pool that it used to have.
So the possibility is lost.
Yeah, the possibility is lost. So what happens then? So what we want to say is that Heidegger only acknowledged our possibilities, projects. But what we want to say that, well, when this kind of breakdown happens, well, that's when our possibility becomes closed. So there has to be a different kind of possibility that's at play, which originally makes the transition from that inauthenticity to anxiety possible.
Yeah. So usually, like when we think about like AI agents, we generally give them some goals, or we define reward, and then in that sense, AIs have some goals. So they are, I don't know, maybe they're in authentic mode or something, but maybe it's kind of more boring kind of AI. So maybe many of us are also interested in implementing intrinsic motivations to AI. So in that case, I don't know, of course it's mathematically defined, but we want to we want AIs to find their own goals, spontaneously. So yeah, so maybe like sort of more traditional like handcrafted AIs don't experience this kind of breakdown, but when AIs also need to discover their goals or sort of motivations, maybe they might become somehow uncertain at some point. For example, one way to implement an intrinsic motivation is to implement curiosity. So so AIs are intrinsically motivated to discover new things in the world. So that's kind of a useful thing. But maybe once AI sort of completely explore the environment, then it becomes almost impossible for this AI to gain new information and satisfy its curiosity. So that might be kind of sort of breakdown. So maybe I'm not sure if I completely understood those Heidegger concepts correctly, but my kind of rough connection is that maybe sort of non-stationarity of rewards that
Yuko,
might
do you
be
want
a source of breakdown. Yes. Go ahead.
Yuko, would you like me? Can I?
Yeah, Arrow. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I'm the co-author. So I'll just make a comment about how I see the connection between the work we're doing here and AI. Okay, so it has to do with the question, what really is intelligence? Before we ask what is artificial intelligence or what is natural or human intelligence, we have to know something about intelligence. Now, if you only take the model of experience that Heidegger offers you, you have to tie intelligence fundamentally to motivation, to projects. And it doesn't, the details don't matter, that's the key. Intelligence somehow arises by us having motivations, right? What we are trying to say is there's a deeper kind of intelligence at work in our experience. And that intelligence calls for us to be able to tune in to the possibilities of the environment. How, for example, the stream is unfolding itself without us interfering with motivations, or with how our own body is breathing, like when you do Buddhist meditation, you have to be conscious of how the breath is moving on its own. And that requires you to tune out of your motivations. Then you tune into this unfolding. And there you start to get a sense of how things are structured, in these phenomena. They're moving by themselves. And then a kind of intelligence starts to emerge, which you can then make into a motivation. Like, I want to realize this state of having a photo. But before that, motivationally bound up intelligence can even arise to, as human beings, have this moment of being able to tune into the world. So I think when we think about artificial intelligence, if we could get away from the model where the robot is just following motivations and somehow make it able to tune in to the environment, and that would mean couple it to the unfolding structures of phenomena, then I think that would be
Can I ask a quick question? So when you say like tuning in with the environment, does it mean like you kind of detach yourself from your motivation or sort of goals, and then you just sort of recognize what's going on in the world?
So I use the word tuning out instead of detachment. So we tune out of the motivations. Let's say this motivation to give it this answer is a kind of project. So we have the possibility to tune out and just tune in to some other way that things are moving already. You know, so as human beings, we have this kind of structure in ourselves, this tuning out, tuning in. Now, I think without that, we wouldn't have any kind of intelligence. We're always drawing intelligence from this naturing. So a robot should also be able to tune out and tune in, I think, to be able to do something like we do.
In AI research, there's a kind of approach to first model something called world models. So that it's a kind of independent of your rewards. So you just try to build a good model of the world just to recognize what's happening out there in an efficient way. And then once you have that model, then you can actually use that model to sort of achieve your goal. So in that sense, I think we could have this kind of modular structure where, on one hand you have motivation and reward, and on the other hand you have sort of a model of the world which you can use for achieving goals, but you don't have to. So,
and how does the robot get this model in this?
So it's through interaction, but maybe it doesn't have to be sort of goal oriented. So maybe just making a lot of observations, sort of like just touching stuff, just to understand how physics works.
So I think this is the key. So here one would have to understand how can touching manifest the ability to tune in to the possibilities of the surface touched. Because I think many models of touching ignore this dimension. So they model it on a motivation to touch, you see. So I think there's a nuanced detail here that's very important with the receptivity structure. That the robot is working with.
Maybe another potentially relevant point I'd like to make is that in the AI field called reinforcement learning, in reality we don't get much reward. So usually we don't. So traditionally we assume that if an AI tries out all kind of different actions, maybe it just hits the right button and then get some rewards. But then the reality is very complex and we hardly get any reward. So it's very difficult to sort of shape intelligence just by reward. So instead, it seems very useful to sort of like train an agent to understand how the world works. And then, first, maybe that's where actually intrinsic motivation and curiosity becomes very relevant. But first, we just interact with the world just to understand how things work. And then later, sort of, we, maybe from sparse rewards, we start to sort of find a way to sort of achieve goals, but using sort of the pre-trained or pre-learned model of the world. So that kind of trend may be sort of relevant to today's talk.
Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of connecting in that kind of very final way.
I think one thing to keep in mind though is the kind of thinly possibilities of AI or robots might be different from thinly possibilities of us, the way human beings work. So for us human beings, especially as adult human beings. We, most of us are have this motivation, right? And work in terms of this motivation. We have all these projects that we engage in. So it's very difficult for us to tune out of these projects and tune in to the way things are unfolding in a spontaneous way. But this kind of difficulty may not arise in AI. This is just our difficulty. AI might have a different way of interacting with its surroundings and environment. And so I think it would be more interesting to try to understand what AI can do and try to understand its intelligence, which might be very different from human intelligence in the way it works, right?
But I have another question. So when you mentioned possibilities, and so I'm trying to interpret this word from maybe a very different perspective. So so for example, we can imagine like many different possibilities, but then but then those possibilities may be still sort of they are still within my sort of existing model. But sometimes when you discover new possibilities, so you encounter things that that you didn't have inside your sort of mental model. So I wonder like which is the case, because like when maybe one sort of typical problem for AI is that it's very difficult to make AI go beyond what they have in their model. So it's very difficult for AIs to discover something that they didn't assume before, or when also relevant models were not built into the system. So yeah, I wonder how these two different types of possibilities are sort of interpreted in the context. I'm not sure if I could make myself clear.
How to discover new possibilities? Well, the way that it works for us, I think, is when we take up different projects, right? So I'm a philosopher, so there are different, I have certain possibilities are open for me. Like I see a book of Hegel, and that's, it affords me the possibility to read it, and which might not be available for someone else, right? But I'm not a scientist, so the possibility to understand all these mathematical equations, those are closed off to me. But once I take up a new project, say of becoming, let's say I take up the project of becoming an AI researcher, that means that suddenly a lot of possibilities become open to me, in the sense that not that necessarily that I can actually do them, but the possibility is now open for me to actualize them. So I think the way it works in humans is that we become, the different projects become open.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I'm kind of trying to like translate those concepts into sort of like AI systems.
Yeah. Errol, you're muted.
Okay. If I can just add my 2 cents and then to that question. So I think the question is about, so even in our case, it seems like as we go on in life, we develop a kind of a model about the world, and everything starts kind of becoming a little bit repetitive for us. I always see the same books, the same computer screen, like there is this sense of like my possibilities are not really being refreshed, let's say. And probably the possibilities, new possibilities I get from other people and so on. So I think the question really becomes, how do we get anything new from nature itself? Some new, very new revolutionary possibility. And I think this is the essence of the questions of the AI, because we give it like these models, kind of like we get it from tradition, like you're brought in this society and it opens up certain ways of looking at the world. How can I possibly look at the world in a new way? The AI has the same problem. And I think the key here is, again, to be able to really listen to, let's say, the bamboo or something, or a pine tree, and you completely tune out of the model that you carry in your head, and you tune in, if you like, to the model that the pine tree has in itself. Really, like, it's kind of structured. And as you tune in to the way the pine is unfolding in its environment, you may be able to soak in some of these structures and reconfigure your model. So again, I would say, like, deep down, to overcome this kind of stagnation or this dead world of possibilities, we need to open ourselves up to nature again, put aside our models, and let nature give us new ways of remodeling, you know. But this is very hard, both for us humans, because if I just simply try to tune into my breath, you know, to simply let go of everything and just let it flow, 100 ideas come up. Or maybe this is waste of time. What am I doing with my life? You know, and these are all models. And, you know, it takes a lot of practice to completely become that perspective where nature can just flow. And I think this is much harder, probably, if it's even possible, for AI to do. You know, like, you give it these models, but how do you make it open to the environment it's in, so you can get new information from that environment? You know, and we are just trying to spell out at least the structures that are there, which open up the possibility of trying to do something like making these machines open up to the unfolding of phenomena. You know? But it's yeah, I think it's a good question. It's very difficult.
Yeah. But we could try to, like, maybe think of a different kind of model that's to put into the AI, which is much more receptive to its surroundings. Yeah, it just tries to listen to what, you know, let's say to the stream. It just tries to listen to the stream, and yeah, I don't even know what it could you know, attempt to do, but it's going to find its way of kind of, you know, being tuning in is not just being passive. It's a different kind of interaction. It's much more receptive and open, and you know, in Japanese we say, you know, with the haiku haiku poem from Matsuo Basho, he says, "Matsu no koto wa matsu ni narae," right? This kind of the pine tree, learn from the pine tree. It's really that this idea that we're you know, we're talking about here. You have to really, like, go into the thing to understand its thing. So we can try to think of a different kind of model where it tries to do that, rather than the AI imposing one model onto it. It tries to kind of, like, take in the external surroundings model that's there, inherent in itself.
And I think that possibility disappears when we understand the model as simply in terms of affordances, because affordances are already bringing our model into the environment. You know, we're seeing the environment in terms of our models that we have, so it becomes affordances. The key is really to think what is an environment. You know, what is nature, and we don't, like, especially in the phenomenological tradition, we don't find any kind. Maybe later Heidegger is different, I don't know, but we find it's already involves our models. So the key is to really rediscover this new, in some sense new, but in many ways the old way of looking at nature, where it has its own models in itself, and we try to say that, if you like, the essential structure of those models is the unfolding towards structure. So it's already there. So there's two radically different sense of environment. One is the environment when we are not imposing our models on it. The other one is the environment when we are imposing our models, and it comes up as affordances. And true intelligence requires us to let go of the model, at least temporarily, and find the natural model, if you like, you know. And that's something that we've forgotten, I think, both in philosophy and in life, because we just have these kind of, we've lost the ability to really be open to nature. So there's this, I guess, the figuring out how to make AI was going to be part of figuring out how to return to our own natural ways, to learn from nature ourselves.
I wonder whether we should consider AIs to be more open to nature or less, because maybe they don't have any other preconception. Maybe some like image recognition systems to just look at images without any thought, right? So, so just interpreting or just sort of labeling stuff. So that's might be could be even more open, but I don't know.
Yeah, I also have like kind of thought like infants. I don't know how you describe them. Like they are more open to the world. I thought like they kind of human being has more open, but making a model and like restricting how they perceive. But I always think that like making AI is something that like how can I say, like learning from infants toward like adults, like because we always like when we become adults somehow we lost some ability, I feel, but so yeah, because
it's interesting. I think one thing that's worthwhile pointing out here, what prevents us from tuning into these, let's call them now natural models, just these structures in nature, is not just our thoughts, it's also our emotions. Sometimes we are so caught up in an emotion, it may be just like sadness or something, that there is a kind of unnaturalness there that's different from simply thought. And I think lots of infants are in fact very emotional. I mean, so it doesn't necessarily mean that they're tuned in just because they're not thinking or something like that. There are many different ways not to be in touch with nature in this sense, but I think that's worth keeping in mind. But I think there is most likely children, it's easier for them to kind of live life from nature itself, than it is when we kind of grow up and acquire this information, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I was going to say the same. I think children have a capacity to tune in a natural way, precisely because they haven't yet acquired the ability to like engage in the project and become motivated in their own goals and so on. So there's a lot to learn from children, basically.
And I think it may be worth just saying something quickly to the previous gentleman's question is about structure. What do we mean by structure? So he gave the example of mathematical structure. So if you take that, so we can think of, if you take a kind of Platonist view, which, there's a structure, a mathematical structure out there that we discover by doing mathematics. So there is some structure that corresponds to our mathematical thoughts and they kind of mirror, let's assume that. But that's only one way of looking at nature as a mathematical, let's say that structure is there, but it's mathematical. But you can think of the unfolding towards structure as kind of like that. It's in nature just as the, let's say, geometrical forms are, but it is not mathematical in the strict sense. It doesn't allow itself to be like quantified, let's say. It doesn't allow itself to be idealized, like it doesn't allow itself to be taken into a mathematical way of thinking, but in another way, it is like, they are like mathematical structures in many ways, So that may be useful. Like out there, it's not only mathematical structures, that's what we come to think. There is much more structure of a different kind in nature. And access to this structure doesn't come by thinking mathematical theorems, it comes by ability to tune in to the breath, to tune in to the unfolding. And this is what I think the great Zen masters were able to do. They were kind of able to do a kind of maths, if you like, by finding out the rhythm of nature. We've just forgotten this, so we can't do it anymore. You know, it's just like kind of, I don't know if that way of looking at it helps, but that's how I see it.
Yes, I think you are right. Mathematical model is only some aspect of the world. And of course, the emotion is also attached. Emotion, this world, you mean world. I understand the world is your construction. Human species illusion, common illusion, collective illusion is the world, I feel. And the AI can help us to find out the way, how they say, go out from the existing picture of the world. Actually, I have been engaged in developing a cancer diagnosis machine with the medical doctor and Shima's company. And we use the mass spectral data to diagnose the cancer, you see. We diagnose. Diagnosis is very, actually there is no substantial, how do you call it, subsistence theory of the cancer. Cancer is just a name, you see. It is named for some phenomenon, some symptom or some other thing. And this diagnostic term is always changing, you see. So this is not the reality, you see. In the scholastic philosophy, there is some how do you call it, controversy between nominalist and realist. You see? The same thing is happening now, I think, you see. So maybe we are too much influenced by the Cartesian Newtonian paradigm, in which you reduce the phenomena into the elements. You articulate element first, and then some chain of causality assumption you make, and then you check it with the experiment. But these kind of things, this causal reasoning is the 200 years ago's thinking, you see. Nowadays, with the machine learning or AI, we are concerned with the simultaneous occurrence probability of the phenomena, you see. So causal reasoning is our illusion. There is no cause and effect, you see. Recently, I read some very interesting book titled by "There is no such thing like time." There's no time, you see. Time is some human construction, which is written by some physicist, quantum field theory physicist. You see. So I'm very much interested in this kind of study.
Yes.
Now we should not be trapped in the causal reasoning. Now, we are more concerned with the statistical probabilistic view of world. So you shouldn't easily name things, you see. And the AI will tell you it is wrong if you erroneously name things, you see, like diagnosis, you see.
Right. So you say like the world is a collective illusion, and we are trapped, and maybe part of that illusion is the idea of causality and so on.
Right.
And this AI will help us see what the things really are behind the illusion, right?
Yes.
But I maybe they will, maybe they're not, but I certainly know that tuning into the thing directly will help too. So why do we need something else to help us find the thing? Part of what we are saying, the thing is already there asking us, put aside your illusion, look at me. But we can't do that. We forgot how to do that because we're so lost in our models and our illusion. So we are saying, well, if we just practice tuning into the unfolding of the thing, we won't need AI to tell us what the thing is outside of our illusion, because the thing will tell us by revealing itself to us directly. You know, that's, and if you want to make a AI that will tell you that, you need to model it on something. You're going to model it on our own intelligence, but our intelligence, as you say, is already illusory. So you're going to maybe just make a AI that has another illusion. I think if you want to make the AI who can directly find the thing, you have to find out first, how can you directly find the thing again, outside your illusion, you know? And that's the real question. How do we get in touch with things directly, not without being stuck in our ideas or illusion of what that thing is, which is kind of in front of it, you know, when we see it like that. So I don't doubt that this AI could do this, but in order for it to do this, we first must understand, how can we do this? You know, how can we find the thing? It's a much more responsible question.
Sure.
Interesting, but I think I am kind of open to the possibility that if we can, you know, we could learn a lot from AI. If we can somehow, maybe by chance, like model an AI to have this kind of receptivity and openness, that we could use that AI. It's kind of weird, but we could use that AI to teach us, to guide us to see this way, this kind of, you know, to look at this part of reality that we're often neglecting, right? That would be an interesting way of using AI, but it does, I think it's also interesting to question, like, what the motivation behind the AI researchers, what are they, why are they trying to create this AI? If it's coming from this kind of, you know, if it's coming from pure curiosity, I think this kind of thing could happen, where we could, you know, create an AI that might even possibly teach us something about a way of seeing reality that has been neglected in human beings. But if it's coming from more of a specific agenda, like we want to create AI to do specific things for us, for example, then I think it's going to be difficult.
I think do you want to make the AI on the model of affordances? You know, if you do that, you are modeling that machine just on how we practically interact with reality. That's what affordances are. But we are saying, in order to model the AI on something in us that is more basic, we have to find that was open to the intelligibility of things, and then we can make very different kind of AI. Basically, the problem is, at least in those AI researchers influenced by Heidegger and Dreyfus and these people, they only see the practical dimension of the human being, the projects and the affordances. And that's what Heidegger saw as well, at least the early Heidegger. We are pointing to a dimension that's not practical, that's open. an open awareness as opposed to a practical awareness. And now let's make the AI on that model. You know, that's I think that's a very promising direction forward in this kind of research.
But we should be careful.
I don't know how to do it myself. I don't know anything about AI. But
I think we should be careful here, though. When you distinguish affordances from this kind of openness, you don't want to say that this kind of openness is just being passive, right?
No.
It's a different kind of like practice, like way of engaging the world. So yeah, and I think that's the key of an understanding a different way. I think we can still use affordance as a word.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, things afford us to engage in them in a specific way.
Are you talking about the same kind of openness when you also mentioned open awareness? Is it the same concept or?
Yeah.
So the idea is like when we are just practically engaged and when we only see our environment in terms of affordances, our awareness is a kind of practical projective awareness. We're always pushing into that motivation, you know, in some sense. We're always aware we have motivation, whatever else, I think. But when you tune into how, let's say, the stream is unfolding, you know, or how the cherry blossom is falling by itself, like you no longer have a sense there is behind this some motivation, but you're still aware. And that awareness is simply the open awareness that allows that object to unfold its own future states. So they're very different qualitative, you know, they just look very different when you look what's going on. So one is called open, one projective.
I see. Yeah, it sounds like you know what you're suggesting, and you know what AI researchers are making going in the opposite direction. So you start from humans, and so we have like all the things. So we have motivations and projects, but maybe for AI, it's harder to build those additional things. So we know it's much easier to start with this more open awareness type intelligence, and then we need to build more sort of more emotional things or goals and motivations on top of that kind of pure more sort of perceptive aspect of intelligence.
Yeah, you say it's easier. I mean, maybe it is, but I myself can't see. So let's say there's a cloud and it's slowly, you know, changing itself, unfolding from one state to another. And we as human beings have in us the possibility of letting go of all our ideas and emotions and just tuning in to that way that cloud is changing. Now, how do you give like a machine that kind of a possibility to tune in to the, you know, changing of things?
Yeah, but in a way, it's just a stream of data. So you can sort of let's say use some very simple something called autoencoder. So it just takes the input stream and then somehow tries to kind of compress the information for interpretation and then just reconstruct the output. So it doesn't do anything about the input, but it just tries to find a sort of interpretation without using it for any particular goal. So it's
oh, that's interesting, right?
Yeah, it's just like understanding sort of what's coming in, and
I see.
Yeah, but that kind of AI is very common. At least
I think, but to make it like more like us, then this is just how I look at it. The next thing that would have to, so it's, let's say it has this information about how the environment is changing. Now the motivations have to fit that environment, you know. So let's say I'm aware of the stream changing, and suddenly I may get like a sense, I may get some feeling of how to change that stream so it fits that flow, you know. So my motivation would draw the information from that unfolding, but it would add some new element, like I'll push this, you know, I'll push this tree this way because that would make the stream flow better. I don't know. So the next step, if you can make the AI be tuned in, is to make it be a bit tuned out so it can interact. I mean, probably people do this, but you know, do you know what I'm saying? And then you have to make it completely, maybe forget it's tuned in, and then make it tune in again, just because that's what we always do. You know, we sometimes completely forget nature, and then that process of remembering is a part of what makes us conscious. So maybe sometimes we have to do a silly thing and make the AI completely go into the model, and then come back, and in this backwards and forwards, it will maybe start looking conscious like us. You know, like, I don't know, these are just ideas I have as
Okay.
Yeah.
I have
Thank you very much. Let
a
me,
quick
sorry.
question.
Let, let me close YouTube, and then you can start asking. So
Yeah,
is that okay? Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for everyone. So yeah, we will, let me share the next talk by the Okay, so yeah, thank you very much everyone joining and watching this video. So we are going to have our next talk on September 25th, like 4 p.m., like by Kazuhisa Shibata, team leader in Riken CBS. So please check it out. And yeah, so thank you very much again. So we're gonna turn off the YouTube live.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
But yeah, you still have a, we can, you know, you can talk in Zoom.